Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this webinar today that you've joined us for. My name is Trey Calvin, and I'm the Communications Director for the Center for Applied Linguistics. Today, you're joining us for a 30-minute webinar as part of our series called Critical Conversations, Research to Policy and Practice. This year, our theme is Equity in Practice, Centering Multilingual Learners. This is our second season of our series. And in this series, we are exploring what it means to take an asset-based approach when working with multilingual learners and how an equity perspective can guide and must guide local, state, and national policy across different educational settings. Today's webinar is entitled Centering Multilingual Learners in Early Literacy Instruction and Its Implications for Policy. But before we begin, I'm just going to take care of a few housekeeping items for this Zoom webinar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to cal.org immediately after this event concludes. It is also live streaming on Facebook and will be posted to our YouTube channel afterwards. The Center for Applied Linguistics is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the persons expressing them and do not necessarily represent the Center for Applied Linguistics views. We are joined by esteemed experts in the field today who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice. And I want you to feel emboldened and empowered to ask them questions as we speak. So please take advantage of the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible by the end of our discussion today. Also, you can click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and share your thoughts and comments. Please go ahead and try it now and let us know where you're calling in from. Note, though, that we will only be checking the Q&A box for specific questions for our panelists. And finally, before we begin, please make sure to mute your microphone and make sure your video is off so that we can avoid any interruptions during the presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our MC today, Lisa Tabaku. Lisa is the Director for Dual Language and Multilingual Education at the Center for Applied Linguistics. She has over 30 years of experience in helping to educate students of diverse languages and cultural backgrounds. Lisa has previously served as a principal researcher and technical assistant consultant at the American Institutes for Research, AIR, supporting the development of processes for identifying students with limited or interrupted formal education. Lisa, thank you so much for hosting us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Trey. And how wonderful is this? Look at the many people who are with us today. We're at, almost 200 and growing for this very important topic delivered by an exceptional researcher, Kathy Escamilla. I'm joined not only by Kathy, but by Ester Jong from the University of Florida. I don't think Ester really needs an introduction to all of you who have come on this afternoon or early evening. But Ester is a board member, as is Kathy, on the Center for Applied Linguistics. And she has been a driver behind these policy to practice to policy, research to policy, sorry, I need to read my screen, webinars that Cal has been offering to you all. And Kathy, again, almost needs no introduction, but I'm going to read just a brief paragraph. Kathy is Professor Emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research relates to the development of bilingualism and biliteracy. She is co-founder of Literacy Squared, that has established the benefits of paired literacy instruction and has been implemented in school districts in 6 states involving 12,500 children and 450 teachers. She has co-authored 3 books and over 60 refereed journal articles and book chapters. What better person is there in the United States today to address this topic with us? So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And we are going to organize our few minutes together. We need to get started right away around three major questions that Lisa's going to pose to me and to the audience, and then we'll be happy to try to answer some questions. So let's move along with the slides because we have very little time.
Okay, so our first question here is, what do we mean by centering multilingual learners in early literacy research and practice?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So what I would like to say is quite simply, over the years, emerging bilingual students, or English language learners, as they are called some places, have been the recipients of many educational reforms, but the reforms themselves have not been created for emerging bilinguals, have not been based on research related to their needs, and consequently have not yielded the benefits in the form of improved academic achievement for emerging bilingual learners that we might like to see. Too often they are considered to be problems to be remediated in schools rather than assets to be developed. And to illustrate that, about 1 in 10 kids now in the US, we know, are emerging bilingual kids, about 5 million kids. And we still have many school systems without the capacity to address needs and assets, and too many school districts where teachers are being told to just teach the kids as if they were monolingual English speaking kids. Good teaching is good teaching. What works for one works for all. And this is something that I think we seriously have to consider, because as a result, we've seen too many of our kids have lower test scores, achieve, at least the way people define achievement, as below grade level. They're twice as likely to drop out of school and less likely to attend a four-year college. And these are all the deficit ways to look at kids instead of saying, we have here a group of kids that have a national treasure, another language. How can we include that in our programs and develop literacy around for them? We have the next slide. I'm not controlling the slides, but okay. So this is nothing new. This is nothing new. I don't mean about the slides. The slides are very new. But in terms of a debate about how to best teach kids, I want to say this to illustrate how emerging bilingual kids have not been the center of this debate. This has always been a debate about how to teach monolingual English-speaking children, and largely in the United States. So it started with Why Johnny Can't Read in the 1950s, where one of the first paragraphs in the book said Johnny can't read because he doesn't know phonics. It has evolved over the years, and I'm going to show you just in a little bit the evolution of what has basically been the same concern among the researchers and teachers of monolingual English-speaking children, but which has never really centered bilingual kids. So the next slide, you all currently know that we are embroiled in something called the science of reading. And what is it? The science of reading is largely based on a 1997 National Reading Panel report. And the National Reading Panel report said that there are 5 foundational skills that children need in order to learn to be good readers. They include phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Again, no quarrel with any of these foundational skills. Kids need to have them. As a result of the National Reading Panel, that factored very heavily into the creation of No Child Left Behind in 2001, and then evolved into a reading initiative, a very large federally funded reading initiative called the Reading First Initiative, in which the federal government invested $6 billion. That's billion with a B. However, and many of our kids, many of the emerging bilingual kids we know and love, were recipients of Reading First programs. Very importantly, the National Reading Panel itself said that they did not address issues relevant to second language learners. Those are their words. Our children were the recipients, and Reading First consequently failed them and also failed the monolingual English-speaking kids that it set out to teach. So could we move on to the next slide? Okay, now what is worrying to those of us who are in the field of bilingual and bicultural and biliterate education is the narrowing of the field according to the science of reading. So our definitions of language and literacy are very broad. We want our kids to know language writ large, reading, oral language, writing, metalinguistic development. This has been narrowed from language, big term, to literacy, further narrowed by the National Reading Panel to reading. Notice reading at the expense of what? Oral language, at the expense of writing, which has further been narrowed to the foundational skills, which has further been narrowed to phonics and decoding. And we are very worried about the narrowing of the curriculum as a result of the science of reading curriculum, which was never centered on emerging bilingual kids and which has not been proven via Reading First and other initiatives to be even effective for monolingual English kids. So let's move along. Okay, so what's the issue here? Why do we need to center? Our kids have been left out of major research syntheses over the past 30 or 40 years, except for Augustin Shanahan, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. The components that are especially needed for emerging bilingual kids, specifically oral language and writing, have been omitted from current movements. In some states, the teaching of writing is told to teachers to be something as an afterthought. Do it if you can, or schedule a different time during the day, but the teaching of the foundation skills in reading is primary. And we know that multilingual learners need more than foundational skills. So we haven't centered our practices on multilingual kids, and we need to. Lisa, is this my next?
I'm sorry. Okay, so Kathy, what are key insights from research on early literacy development for multilingual learners?
So I'm glad you asked that, especially since it's on the slide. I don't know what I would say if it was a different question. Okay, the next slide. What do we know? This is a very serious issue, but we have to take ourselves lightly and the issue seriously. So on the next slide, as a result of the failure to include emerging bilingual kids in the 1997 reading research panel, I do not know what happened to my slides. I apologize.
All right, that's on me, Kathy. I'm gonna get that back up. Too many screens running at one time. Give me 1 second. Thank
no
you.
problem. I lived in fear I was going to do this. So okay.
Here we go. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, so in 2006, a subsequent panel was composed and was constituted, which was called the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth. And what they did was they said, and I'm quoting, this is 2006, this is 16 years ago. There are the 5 components of reading instruction are not sufficient for English learners. What does that mean? We need to do more, not less. Second language development and literacy is different from development in your first language. They emphasize the role of the home language, cross-language connections, and the viability of dual language programs. They emphasize the important role of oral language as a foundation for literacy and the integration of the 4 domains of language. Finally, and most importantly, for those of us who have taught for many, many years, we know many kids who decode very well and do not understand what they're reading. There's a key role in meaning making and comprehension, which is why we learn to read. So let's move on. Okay, in 2020, I'm going to make this very brief, this part very brief, because you can go and read the research yourself. But the Reading Research Quarterly issued a call for papers for a special edition on the science of reading, calling for critiques, calling for praise, calling for what we need to do. And I wanted to pick a few of those quotes. I was fortunate enough to be one of the co-editors of these 2 special issues, but I want to note the first and the last. So despite the changing demographics in the US, mainstream reading research remains entrenched in Anglocentrism, Eurocentrism, and another form of ethnocentrism, and that of alphabetism. In fact, many children in the world are not learning to read from alphabetic language principles. And so this idea that there are universal principles and all children in the world, no matter what their languages are, need the same foundational skills is a bit questionable. The third one actually is I'm going to mention, it calls for more attention to the linguistic, cultural, and individual variation, which is what I know that bilingual teachers and teachers of emerging bilingual kids have been doing forever. And finally, and probably very, very important to this conversation, is that bilingual education promotes bilingualism and biliteracy, which has mostly been ignored in the literacy debates over English only versus bilingual instruction. So moving on, it boils down to this. The science of reading is largely about monolingual English ideologies, and debates about which approach are largely about monolingual researchers talking to other monolingual researchers about how to teach reading to monolingual kids. And then all of these principles have been imposed upon emerging bilingual kids with impunity. The same is not equal. Next slide, please. And actually, let's skip to, the next slide also. We know that teaching emerging bilingual kids is alike and different than teaching monolingual learners. We agree that kids need to learn the foundational skills, but we disagree that this is the same for emerging bilingual kids as it is for kids who are monolingual English. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip a couple of slides and ask Trey to move us along. Next one, please. The next one, please. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is an example that we might hear in any first grade classroom by a teacher who's trying to teach phonemic awareness a lesson on the sounds of sofa and the sounds that go together to make the word sofa. And she might say, okay, my friends, let's clap the number of sounds we hear in the word sofa. Oh, ah. Okay, now that sounds simple. Anybody ought to be able to do that. However, if you don't speak English, you are not just learning the concept of putting sounds together to make a word, you're learning everything else about the teacher talk, what the teacher's expectations are, what's going to get you in trouble, what you're supposed to do. So when she says, okay, my friends, it's her getting the children's attention. She doesn't say sit down and shut up. We've been taught to be nice when we're teaching kids. So he said, okay, my friends. Clap means put your hands together to make a noise. Sounds mean phonemes or a concept or the concept of a sound. Kids have to know the concept of a sound. They have to know the word, the concept of a word. They have to know the sounds go together to make words. They have to know numbering in order to count the sounds. They have to know that words have meaning. Hopefully they know what a sofa is, and they have to know how many are there, how many sounds are there, and did we do it correctly means we got 4 for an answer. There are 4 sounds or 4 phonemes. Okay, that sounds easy, but think of the learning load on emerging bilingual kids that is not present for monolingual English kids. We cannot do the same thing and then be disappointed when we get a different result. So let's move on.
So our last question, what are key policy changes we should be aspiring to? What needs to change to have effective literacy development for multilingual learners in English and other languages?
This is just an excellent question and one that we could discuss forever, but let's move along. And there are some simple and complex. So we need to move beyond foundational skills. What is it that emerging bilingual kids need? Well, emerging bilingual children in English medium programs need to have oral language. They need to be learning oral language as they are learning to read. They need both. What is the feasibility question? How do we do this? When do we do this? In a 90-minute literacy block, when we know that for ELD takes about 45 minutes a day. Do we spend half of our day in what we call literacy blocks? We need oral language development. The kids need writing. Kids need meta-linguistic development. They need to know how language works, as I just showed you. They need to know the concept of a sound and a word. They need to read for meaning and not just decoding. I want to emphasize they need to see themselves in the curriculum, and they need to have their first languages valued and used in the classroom even if it's an English medium classroom. Phonics is meant to be a short-term intervention for a few minutes a day and not to be extended past the 3rd grade. Could we have the next slide? The improvement of literacy for emerging bilingual kids has to include 2 efforts. One for emerging bilingual kids who are not in bilingual programs for many, many reasons. And it has to include the development, the growth, and the improvement of dual language programs. We need to do both simultaneously, and they're not mutually exclusive. We need foundational skills plus. We need a science of biliteracy, which has not even been approached by the current science of reading people. And we need increased and improved opportunities for the development of bilingualism and biliteracy. It's easy to put on 4 little points in a PowerPoint slide. It's harder yet to enact in policy and practice, but that's what we need to do. Y vale la pena. It's worth the effort. Next slide, please. Okay, all of this comes from this is a shameless promotion for a white paper that I helped put together with Lori Olson from the Californians Together and Jody Slavic from the University of Colorado at Boulder. So if you're interested in reading more, and if you're interested in learning more about the science of reading and how we need to improve it for emerging bilingual kids, there is a website, the National Committee for Effective Literacy, at www.multilingualliteracy.org. And now I think we're ready for preguntas or questions.
We are indeed. People have been having interesting discussions in the chat and also in the questions and answers, asking all kinds of interesting pieces, Kathy. One of the ones I want to start off with has to do with advocacy. So it's a nice follow-up on the policy implication questions. And the question that Josie earlier was asking, how do we best argue against structured literacy or the science of reading initiatives that are being forced upon states via legislation, not only for English language learners, but also for all populations, including early childhood students and students with special needs? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that with us in terms of the arguments that we can bring forward, and that might help a little bit maybe. So what is that science of literacy all about?
Okay, so I think that's just a very, very good question. I'm going to try to be succinct, and then I'm going to invite you, Esther and Lisa, to actually join in. So the first thing is we have evidence that reading first, which is the precursor to the science of reading, failed kids. Why would we want to repeat a failed experiment? Why do we want to repeat that? We have seen no rebuttal or refutation of the findings of the IES in 2008, which said that reading first did not improve comprehension in students, did not even improve foundational skills beyond the 1st grade, and didn't improve student engagement. And we all know what an issue student engagement is with literacy. So it's not that we oppose teaching the foundation skills. We don't have research to support the level at which they are being imposed upon states and school districts. So it's foundation skills plus more. Oral language development and writing and comprehension are critical for second language learners, and those have largely been left out of many state policies.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's maybe a follow-up. One of the things that is also sometimes that people observe is the fact that early literacy is very important, and focusing on those grade levels is very important. But as you pointed out earlier, that's not where all of our English language learners are, right, in the United States. So one question that came up was that you talked about not including phonics after 3rd grade, but what about students who enter secondary grades who may not come from a phonetically based language? How might we think about that older group of students that are also in our schools?
Right. And I think that, again, these are just wonderful questions. I wish we had a whole lot of time to debate them. But older kids entering school who may or may not be literate in their first language, if they're literate in their first language, we all know it's a whole different ballgame. That an entry into literacy, you don't need the foundational skills such as phonics. You don't need that. They already have literacy. They know there's a directionality. They know sound symbol correspondence. You just need to teach them what's different in English. You don't need to go back to kindergarten and first grade level phonics. I'm very, very concerned about reading policies in states that say that that is a good practice. I question that as being a valid or a good practice or a good use of kids' time. Even for kids who enter school not being literate in their first language, being 16 is different than being 6. And they have a lifetime of experiences that we can use to teach them to read and write in English that are based on what do you need to do to be successful in school. And short I may be one of them, but is probably not the most necessary skill to be teaching.
Yeah, what an important part to be thinking about. So here's another question. So we talk a lot about English and phonics, but is there any difference in terms of that continuum of literacy development when you start thinking about Spanish as well? Does that look different? And what are some differences then between English and Spanish early reading instruction?
Yeah, I wish we had planned 3 hours for this conversation.
I know,
So,
we only have
yes,
2 minutes.
yeah.
So
the teaching we have in the research that I have been involved in over the years, we have always advocated for early entry into literacy in the language that we're using methodology that is authentic to the language. And so we do not advocate for English phonics translated into Spanish or any other language, as that doesn't make sense. And sadly, we're seeing a lot of that. Kids in Mexico, for example, start to learn to read at the word level first, and then they take words, because a word is a level of meaning. They take words and then they break them down into syllables and phonemes. They take words and they build them up into sentences and phrases and paragraphs. But the word is the unit of meaning. I'm going to mention a study by Goldenberg and others that was conducted in 2014, which actually found that kids in Mexico receive very little instruction in phonemic awareness or phonics in the early grades in Mexico. And yet they read better in Spanish than kids in the US, for whom their early literacy instruction, by the second grade, for whom their early literacy instruction was in Spanish, but using English-centric methods. So if you're going to teach in biliterate programs, make your entries into teaching authentic to the language that you are teaching to the target language.
Yeah, that's so important. I know we're heading to the very end of things, but I wonder if we can squeeze in one more question here around the bilingual program. Somebody was noting that they are starting an 80-20 Spanish-English dual language immersion program. And beginning in kindergarten, they learn language arts literacy skills in Spanish, and their English language arts time, 20% of the day is focused on oral language. English learners in these classes receive services from an ESL teacher. What do you recommend the ESL teacher focus on? Challenges are that these students must take an annual English proficiency test, of course, in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the state expectation is that the ESL teachers all 4 domains. What might you have as a recommendation to this, how we structure English ESL in these kinds of programs?
Well, I think ESL should be linked to literacy, but ESL is about teaching English. It's not about teaching phonemes. It's about teaching kids English when they are learning the language. At the same time, they're expected to learn to read and write it. If they are learning, for example, foundational skills in Spanish, those are foundational skills, many of which will transfer to English. And so you don't need to teach those foundational skills twice. Teach them in Spanish, and then when as kids progress through the grades, teach what's different about English. But spend your ELD time on teaching English.
Yeah, thank you for that one. It's like such a classic notion, right? In bilingual education, talking about going back to foundations, that notion of transfer really, really matters. we're hitting the end of our presentation. Trey, why don't you take it away to close us out? Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Kathy, and a round of
My
applause
pleasure,
for
my
our
pleasure.
wonderful speaker and for our MCs, Lisa Tabaku and Ester Jong. That is all the time we have today. We would like to thank you all, our audience members, for your questions and comments and enthusiasm in the chat box around this critical conversation. We encourage you to share what you've learned today with your colleagues, not just with what Kathy said, but also digitally when we post this online. And in that vein, we'll be sending you a follow-up email with a link to this recording, as well as a brief survey to tell us how we did and what we can do next time. We also invite you to join us for our next webinar in the series entitled Reframing Literacies Through the Eyes of Refugees and SLIFE students on June 14th, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern. An email will be coming to your inbox shortly with a link to sign up for that webinar. Again, thank you so much for your time today, and we wish you the best of luck and have a great rest of your week. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you,
Bye,
Esther.
everybody.
See you guys soon.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.